The recruitment line stretched across the polished floor of Sentinel-7's training wing. David Reed shifted his weight from one foot to the other, watching dozens of alien species fidget in their own ways. Some had tails that twitched. Others had antennae that drooped with boredom. A few had multiple arms that they didn't seem to know what to do with. He'd been waiting for 2 hours now. The Galactic Peacekeeping Force didn't move quickly, apparently. That was fine. David had spent 3 years in Earth's military learning how to wait. The rifle slung across his back felt comfortable and familiar, even if every other recruit carried weapons that hummed with energy or glowed with power cells. Next group, a voice called out. It came from Instructor Threll, a being that looked like someone had crossed a hawk with a person and given it 4 arms. Threll's feathers were deep blue, and his eyes were sharp enough to count individual hairs from across the room. David walked forward with 5 other recruits. They entered a massive chamber that had to be at least 100 meters across. The walls were smooth metal, but he could see projectors built into the ceiling and floor. Holographic technology, probably. The kind that could create training scenarios that felt real enough to hurt. "Welcome to the Breach Protocol simulation," Threll announced. His voice had a musical quality to it, rising and falling like a bird's call. This scenario has been running for 200 standard years. In that time, 16,000 recruits have attempted it. 0 have completed it. One of the other recruits, a massive reptilian creature named Grant, made a rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. "Then why do we try?" "Because failure teaches humility," Threll said. "And humility keeps you alive when you face impossible odds." The scenario is simple. Navigate through a contested zone and reach the extraction point. The problem is that the entire zone is covered by something called a null field generator. David felt his stomach tighten. He'd heard about null fields during the briefings. Technology that could shut down electronics, jam weapons, and turn advanced military hardware into expensive paperweights. The hostile species that used them had been carving through peacekeeper forces for years. "The null field will disable all energy weapons within seconds," Threll continued. "Most projectile weapons will jam because their electronic firing systems will fail. Your armor's power supply will die. Your communication devices will stop working. You will be alone, unarmed, and vulnerable. When that happens, you retreat. That is the lesson. Some battles cannot be won." Threll's 4 arms moved in a complex gesture. "Who wants to try first?" Grant stepped forward immediately, his scales gleaming under the chamber's lights. He carried an energy rifle that probably cost more than David's entire paycheck. The weapon had a scope that could track targets through walls and a power cell that could fire for hours without reloading. The simulation began. Holographic enemies appeared, scattered across a ruined cityscape that materialized around Grant. He raised his rifle and squeezed the trigger. The weapon's light died instantly. He tried the backup systems, the emergency protocols, everything. Nothing worked. After 30 seconds of fumbling with dead equipment, he walked out of the simulation zone, his expression dark. Next, Threll called point. 3 more recruits tried. 3 more recruits failed. Their weapons died the moment the null field activated. One recruit tried to throw her weapon at the holographic enemies in frustration. It passed right through them without effect. "You." Threll pointed at David with one of his 4 hands. "The human. Your turn." David walked into the chamber. The other recruits were watching now, pressing against the observation glass. He could hear them whispering. Humans were new to the galactic community, only joining the Peacekeepers 5 years ago. Most species still didn't know what to make of them. The simulation activated. David felt a strange prickling sensation across his skin as the null field kicked in. His rifle's electronic scope went dark immediately. The smart targeting system that he never used anyway shut down. His backup communicator on his belt made a sad beeping sound and died, but the rifle itself still felt solid in his hands. He raised it to his shoulder, aimed at the first holographic enemy, and pulled the trigger. The weapon fired with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. The holographic enemy flickered and disappeared as the training computer registered the hit. David moved forward, firing in controlled bursts. His rifle was old technology by galactic standards. No computer chips, no power cells, no electronic components beyond the scope that he'd already learned to ignore. Just a spring-loaded firing pin, a bit of gunpowder, and a metal projectile accelerated by expanding gas. Chemistry and physics that hadn't changed in hundreds of years. He heard Threll's voice over the intercom. "Reed, your weapon should not be functioning. The scenario is over. Please exit the chamber." David didn't exit. Instead, he pressed the magazine release on his rifle. The empty magazine clattered to the floor. He pulled a fresh one from his belt and slammed it home with a solid click. The sound was mechanical, satisfying, completely manual. He pulled back the charging handle and let it snap forward, chambering a new round. Then he kept firing. The observation area had gone completely silent. David could see alien faces pressed against the glass, their expressions ranging from confusion to shock. Threll had stopped talking. Even the holographic enemies seemed to pause for a moment, as if the computer running the simulation wasn't sure what to do with a weapon that still worked. David cleared the first zone, then the second. He moved through the ruined cityscape like he'd trained to do back on Earth. Use cover. Count your shots. Make every bullet matter. When his magazine ran empty, he reloaded. When the simulation threw more enemies at him, he adjusted his tactics. The rifle in his hands wasn't smart. It wasn't powerful compared to energy weapons. It couldn't track targets or see through walls. But it worked. In a zone where everything else failed, where retreat was supposed to be the only option, his simple mechanical weapon kept firing. After 15 minutes, David reached the extraction point. A holographic shuttle appeared above him, and the simulation ended. The ruined cityscape faded away, leaving only the empty chamber and the sound of his own breathing. The doors opened. David walked out with his rifle slung across his back and 3 empty magazines hanging from his belt. Threll stood frozen, his data pad held loosely in one of his 4 hands. The instructor's eyes were wide, his feathers standing up in a way that probably meant shock. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Pius Santos, another human recruit who worked as an engineer, started laughing. It was a nervous sound, but it broke the tension. "How?" Threll finally managed to ask. David shrugged. "You said electronic systems would fail. My rifle doesn't have any." Word spread through Sentinel-7 before David even left the training wing. Commander Yali's lived inside a crystalline body that refracted light into rainbow patterns across her office walls. She sat behind a desk that looked too small for someone in charge of training for the entire galactic peacekeeping force. When David entered, flanked by Instructor Threll and Pia, Yali's made a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Explain," she said. Her voice came from somewhere inside the crystal structure, echoing slightly. "Explain how a human recruit completed a scenario specifically designed to be impossible." David had been rehearsing this conversation in his head for the past 3 hours. He'd expected anger, maybe accusations of cheating. Instead, Yali's just seemed tired. There was another person in the room too, an insectoid being named Court, whose species name David couldn't pronounce. Court's compound eyes were focused entirely on the rifle David had placed on the desk. "The null field shuts down electronics," David said. "My rifle doesn't use electronics. It's mechanical. You pull the trigger, a spring releases a pin, the pin strikes the primer ignites gunpowder, and expanding gas pushes the bullet out of the barrel. No computers, no power cells, no electronic firing system." Court reached out with a chitinous limb and picked up the rifle. The Hiver analyst turned it over slowly, examining every component. "Fascinating," Court clicked. "It's essentially a controlled explosion delivery device. We studied these in historical military courses. Most species abandoned this technology 3,000 years ago. Humans kept using them," Pia added. She'd been quiet until now, but her engineer's brain was already 10 steps ahead. "We have energy weapons too, but we never stopped manufacturing ballistic firearms. They work in electromagnetic pulse zones. They work in deep space without power armor. They work underwater if you design them right. They're reliable." Threll ruffled his feathers. "Reliable, but primitive." The energy rifles used by peacekeepers can fire for hours without reloading. They have smart targeting systems that increase accuracy by 40%. They can switch between lethal and non-lethal modes instantly. And they're useless against null fields, Yali said quietly. The rainbow patterns on the walls dimmed. We've encountered 3 hostile species in the past decade that use this technology. Every engagement has ended in retreat or worse. The Corvith Empire wiped out an entire colony on Harvest Prime because our peacekeepers couldn't fight back. 5,000 civilians died, while trained soldiers stood by with dead weapons. The room fell silent. David had heard stories about Harvest Prime. The peacekeepers had tried everything. Melee weapons, improvised explosives, physical barriers. Nothing worked fast enough. By the time reinforcements arrived with equipment that might bypass the null field, the colony was gone. We need options, Yali's continued. The Galactic Council keeps telling us to pursue diplomatic solutions. They say violence only breeds more violence. They're not wrong, but they're not the ones watching colonists die while holding useless weapons. Court set the rifle back on the desk with surprising gentleness. This could change the tactical situation entirely. If we equipped peacekeeper units with human ballistic weapons as secondary armament, they would maintain combat capability even in null field zones. The Council would never approve it, Threll said. His 4 arms crossed in what David had learned was a gesture of skepticism. Most species view human weapons as barbaric. There's a reason the galaxy moved away from projectile weapons. They're loud, they're crude, and they require carrying physical ammunition. Energy weapons are cleaner, more efficient, more civilized. Civilized, Yali's repeated. The words seemed to hurt her. We were very civilized at Harvest Prime, right up until everyone died. Commander Yali stood up. Her crystalline form caught the light and scattered it across the ceiling. I'm authorizing an experimental training program. Reed, you and Santos will train a select group of recruits on human ballistic weapons. We'll start small, 30 recruits from different species. If this works, we expand. If it doesn't, we bury it. What about the Council? Pia asked. The Council doesn't need to know every training exercise we conduct, Yali said. There was something hard in her voice now. They can debate philosophy and diplomatic protocols from their comfortable chambers. Out here, we're the ones who have to fight when diplomacy fails. Threll made a whistling sound. If this becomes public and fails, it will reflect poorly on the entire training division. If this stays private and we do nothing, more people will die, Yali's countered. I've made my decision. You have 6 weeks to put together a training program. Show me that human weapons can make a difference. David looked at Pia, who gave him a slight nod. We'll need access to manufacturing for modified weapons, Pia said. Not every species has the hand structure to operate a standard human rifle. We'll need to adapt triggers, stocks, and grips for different physiologies. You'll have access to Workshop Base 7, Yali said. Court will assist with technical specifications. Threll, you'll observe and provide tactical input. I want this done right. After they left the commander's office, David and Pia walked through the corridors of Sentinel 7 in silence. Other recruits passed them, some staring, some whispering. Word had already spread about the simulation. Humans had done something that no one else could do. The reactions ranged from impressed to suspicious to outright hostile. This is bigger than we thought, Pia finally said. They'd reached the residential section, where small rooms housed recruits from across the galaxy. We're not just teaching people how to shoot. We're teaching them to think differently about combat. David nodded. He'd spent 3 years in Earth's military learning that lesson himself. The best weapon wasn't always the most powerful one. Sometimes the best weapon was the one that worked when everything else failed. 6 weeks, he said. Think we can teach alien species how to use firearms in 6 weeks? Pia grinned. We're humans. We once taught ourselves how to split atoms and leave our own planet. Teaching someone how to pull a trigger should be easy. It wasn't going to be easy, David knew, but that had never stopped humans before. They'd built civilizations in deserts and jungles. They'd survived ice ages and plagues. They'd learned to thrive in environments that should have killed them. Teaching a few alien species how to reload a rifle was just another impossible task on a very long list. Somewhere in the station, 30 recruits were being selected for a training program they didn't know about yet. In 6 weeks, they would either prove that human methods could save lives, or they would prove that some ideas were better left in the past. David suspected it would be the former. Humans had a talent for making impossible things possible, one stubborn step at a time. Workshop Bay 7 smelled like metal and oil. Pia had already claimed half the space for her modifications, spreading tools and weapon components across 3 workbenches. David stood in the cleared area they designated for training, looking at the 30 recruits who'd been selected for the program. They were nervous. He could see it in the way they held themselves, in the way they glanced at each other, and at the rifles lined up against the wall. 30 different species, 30 different body types, and only 6 weeks to teach them skills that had taken David years to master. "My name is David Reed," he said. "This is Pia Santos. We're both human, which you probably already figured out. We're here to teach you how to use weapons that will work when your standard equipment fails." A feline-looking recruit raised a paw. Her fur was silver with black stripes, and her ears were pinned back against her head. "I'm Nita. Why should we learn to use primitive weapons? Won't that make us weaker in normal combat situations?" "No," David said. "You'll still carry your energy weapons. Those are better for 99% of situations. But for that last 1%, when you're facing a null field or an electromagnetic pulse or equipment failure, you need something that works without electricity." He picked up one of the rifles Pia had modified. This one had a larger trigger guard and a shortened stock. "This is a ballistic rifle. It uses chemical propellant to fire a metal projectile. The technology is old, but old doesn't mean useless." Grant, the massive reptilian recruit from David's original test group, stood near the back. "I tried to operate one of those after your demonstration. It didn't fire because you treated it like an energy weapon," Pia said. She walked over with a rifle in her hands. "Energy weapons are smart. They do most of the work for you. Ballistic weapons are dumb. You have to do the work yourself." She demonstrated the manual charging process, showing them how to chamber a round, how to check if the weapon was loaded, how to clear a jam. Her movements were precise and practiced. Every species here has different hands, different fingers, different strength levels. That's why I spent the last 3 weeks modifying these weapons. They'll work for your physiology, but you need to learn the basics first. The training started simple. David taught them how to hold the weapons, how to breathe, how to align the sights. Most of them had never aimed without a computer doing the calculation. They had to learn to judge distance with their own eyes, to compensate for wind, to understand that bullets followed a curved path instead of traveling in a straight line like energy beams. Nira struggled with the recoil. The first time she fired, the rifle kicked back hard enough to bruise her shoulder. She dropped the weapon and hissed, her fur standing up along her spine. David approached her carefully, giving her space. "It hurts," she said, her voice tight with pain and embarrassment. "It does," David agreed, "but you can learn to manage it. Lean into the shot instead of pulling away. Let your body absorb the force instead of fighting it. Try again." She looked at him with green eyes that showed more white than usual. Fear. But she picked up the rifle anyway and took up position. This time, when she fired, she stayed standing. The shot went wide, but she didn't drop the weapon. "Better," David said. Across the bay, Court was working with a recruit named Len, a lizard-like being whose species had excellent eyesight but weak grip strength. Pia had modified a rifle with a lighter trigger pull and added a grip aid that helped Len hold the weapon steady. Len approached the weapon like an engineering problem, asking questions about every component and taking notes on a personal data pad. "Why this caliber?" Len asked, examining the ammunition. "Wouldn't a larger projectile do more damage?" "Larger projectiles mean more recoil and heavier ammunition," Court explained. The Hiver analyst had taken to the teaching role surprisingly well. Human military doctrine favors intermediate cartridges because they balance stopping power with controllability. You can carry more ammunition and maintain accuracy during sustained fire. Bosk, the gentle giant from a high-gravity world, had the opposite problem from Nira. He was so strong that he kept breaking the trigger mechanisms. Pia eventually gave him a heavy rifle designed for human anti-vehicle use, something with reinforced components that could handle his strength. He handled it like a toy, but at least he stopped breaking things. The days blurred together. Morning drills on weapon handling. Afternoon sessions on accuracy and tactics. Evening maintenance where they learned to clean and repair their weapons. David watched them improve slowly, picking up skills that felt natural to humans but were foreign to species raised on energy weapons. The hardest part wasn't the physical skills. It was the mindset. Energy weapons were forgiving. They had large magazines, long range, and smart targeting systems that compensated for poor technique. Ballistic weapons were harsh teachers. Miss your shot, and you'd wasted ammunition. Fail to maintain your weapon, and it would jam at the worst possible moment. Forget to count your rounds, and you'd run dry in the middle of a firefight. I don't understand why humans use these, Nira said one evening. She was cleaning her rifle, working oil into the metal parts like David had taught her. You have the technology for better weapons. Why keep making these? David was cleaning his own rifle nearby. The familiar ritual helped him think. Because technology fails, power runs out. Electronics break. But chemistry and physics work the same way they did 1,000 years ago. A rifle from my great-grandfather's time would still fire today if I maintained it properly. Can you say the same about your energy weapon? Nero was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my sister was at Harvest Prime. She was a peacekeeper. Her weapon died when a null field activated. She tried to fight with her hands, but the enemy had weapons that still worked. I found out later they were using projectile weapons, old slug throwers from some forgotten war. She had training and courage and the best equipment the galactic military could provide. None of it mattered. I'm sorry, David said. Don't be sorry, Nero replied. Her claws clicked against the rifle's metal surface as she worked. Teach me how to make sure no one else goes through what she did. Teach me how to fight back. By the end of the third week, all 30 recruits could field strip their weapons blindfolded. They could clear jams, switch magazines, and maintain accuracy at 50 meters. They weren't experts yet, but they were competent. More importantly, they understood the philosophy behind what they were learning. Threll observed from the sidelines, taking notes on his datapad. The instructor hadn't said much during the training, but David caught him nodding occasionally when a recruit did something right. After one particularly good shooting session, Threll approached David. They're improving faster than I expected, the avian instructor said. But training bay performance isn't the same as combat effectiveness. The Galactic Council is going to want proof that this works in real scenarios. Then we'll give them proof, David said. The Council has agreed to a field test, Threll continued. One chance to prove that ballistic weapons can make a difference against null field technology. If your recruits fail, the program ends. The Council may even ban human military exports entirely. David looked at his recruits. Nero was helping Bosk with his stance. Len was explaining bullet trajectory to another recruit using diagrams in the air. They'd come so far in such a short time. But were they ready for a real test? When? David asked. 2 weeks, Threll said. Start preparing them. The abandoned mining station hung in space like a broken tooth. David could see it through the transport window as they approached, a sprawling complex of tunnels and processing facilities that had been shut down for 20 years. Somewhere inside, Galactic Council technicians had installed 3 authentic null field generators captured from hostile forces. Beside him, Nira checked her rifle for the 5th time. Her paws shook slightly as she worked. Len sat across from them, eyes closed, running through mental calculations. Bosk took up 2 seats at the back of the transport, his heavy rifle resting across his knees. The rest of the ballistic team filled the remaining spaces, each lost in their own preparations. Remember the plan, David said, keeping his voice steady. We land, we advance, we adapt. The null field will activate immediately. Your communication devices will fail. You'll be using hand signals and line of sight. Stay within visual range of your team members. Qual, the amphibious scout, made a bubbling sound that meant acknowledgement in his species. He'd been the quietest recruit during training, but his stealth skills were exceptional. If anyone could spot ambushes before they happened, it was called a transport dock. Through the airlock, David could see another transport already attached to the station. That would be Grant's team, the energy weapon specialists who would be running the same course simultaneously. The comparison wasn't official, but everyone knew this was a competition. Traditional galactic military doctrine versus human methods. 200 years of advancement versus weapons that humans had been using for centuries. Commander Yali's was waiting in the docking bay. Her crystalline form reflected the harsh station lighting. Behind her stood several council members and at least a dozen observers from various species. They'd come to see if the human approach would work or if it was just an expensive waste of time. Both teams will deploy simultaneously, Yali's explained. Your objectives are identical. Secure the station, disable the null field generators, and hold the core for 10 minutes. The generators will activate 30 seconds after deployment, giving both teams time to prepare. Grant led his team past them. He was equipped with top-tier peacekeeping gear. Power armor, energy rifles with extended range, smart grenades, portable shields. His team moved with practiced precision. They'd been working together for months, drilling on standard galactic tactics. David's team had been together for 6 weeks and were carrying modified weapons that half the council considered obsolete. Don't let them get in your head, Pia whispered. She wasn't going in with the combat team, but she'd insisted on being here for final equipment checks. Your weapons work. That's all that matters. The teams deployed from opposite ends of the station. David led his group through a cargo airlock that opened into a long corridor lined with machinery. Emergency lighting flickered overhead, casting shadows that moved when they shouldn't. The holographic system was already active, creating the illusion of a contested environment. 30 seconds. David used the time to check his team's positions. Nira and Qual took point. Lynn and another recruit named Ferris covered the flanks. Bosk brought up the rear with his heavy rifle. They practiced these formations dozens of times in the training bay. The null field activated. David felt it like pressure in his ears, a wrongness in the air. His communication device went silent mid-transmission. The smart scope on his rifle died, leaving only the basic iron sights. Emergency lighting dimmed further as electronic systems throughout the station failed, but his rifle still worked. He chambered a round manually, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. Around him, his team did the same. 30-plus metallic clicks that meant they were armed and ready. Through his earpiece's last transmission, David had heard Grant's team status. Their weapons had died instantly. Power armor locked up. Communication went dark. They were executing retreat protocols, falling back to the extraction point where they could leave the null field zone and regroup. Standard doctrine. Smart doctrine. Doctrine that left the enemy in control of the objective that David's team moved forward. They used hand signals now, basic military communication that every species could understand. Qual gestured ahead. 3 contacts, defensive position. Nira acknowledged and moved to flanking position. Bosk shifted to provide covering fire if needed. The holographic enemies were based on real threat data. They carried projectile weapons of their own, crude but effective. This was what the hostile species had been using against peacekeepers for years. While galactic forces stood with dead weapons, the enemy kept shooting. David took the first shot. The holographic enemy flickered and registered as eliminated. His team spread out, using cover, advancing in controlled bounds. It was slow, methodical, nothing like the overwhelming firepower that energy weapons could provide. But they were advancing while Grant's team was retreating. They reached a junction where 3 corridors met. Lynn examined the paths, calculating angles and potential ambush points. His mathematical mind had adapted well to ballistic combat. He pointed left, signed that the path was clear. They moved that a holographic enemy appeared from behind a support beam. Nira fired twice, fast reflexive shots that put round center mass. The enemy disappeared. She'd overcome her fear of recoil, learned to trust her training. Her sister would have been proud. The station's interior was a maze of tunnels and chambers. Without electronic mapping, They had to navigate by memory and physical markers. Qual left small chemical traces at each junction, markers that only his species could see, but that would help them find their way back if needed. Old scout techniques, the kind that didn't rely on satellites or computers, they encountered more enemies. Ferris took a hit from a simulated weapon and went down. The training system registered it as a leg wound, non-fatal but mobility limiting. Bosk immediately moved to cover him, while Nira provided suppressing fire. They'd practiced casualty evacuation dozens of times. Even wounded, Ferris could still shoot from a supported position. The core chamber appeared ahead. 3 null field generators stood in a triangular formation, humming with power. Holographic enemies defended the position in force. This was a final test. Could they take and hold the objective for 10 minutes against increasing resistance? Positions, David signed. His team spread out, using the chamber's industrial equipment for cover. Len found an elevated position that gave him clear sight lines across the entire room. Qual disappeared into the shadows, ready to ambush any flanking attempts. Nira and 2 others formed the main defensive line. The assault began. Holographic enemies poured in from multiple entry points. David's team responded with controlled fire, making every shot count. They couldn't waste ammunition on suppression or wild spraying. Each trigger pull had to have purpose. Len's rifle jammed. David saw it happen from across the chamber. The recruit froze for a second, then fell back on training. He cleared the jam in under 5 seconds and was back in the fight. That 5 seconds could have been fatal in real combat, but it was better than being completely helpless with a dead energy weapon. Time crawled. David's team burned through magazines, covering each other while they reloaded. The holographic enemies adapted, probing for weaknesses, testing their defensive positions. This wasn't a simple training scenario anymore. The computer was simulating an intelligent enemy that learned and adapted. Boss' position took heavy fire. His heavy rifle kept him at bay, but he was running low on ammunition. David tossed him his last spare magazine. Boss caught it, reloaded, and kept firing. The big recruit's gentleness had given way to fierce protectiveness. He wouldn't let the line break. 0.8 minutes. 9. The holographic enemies were overwhelming now, more than any real engagement would probably throw at them. The test was pushing them to their absolute limits. Nira took another hit, shoulder this time. She switched her rifle to her offhand and kept shooting. 10 minutes. The simulation ended. The holographic enemies vanished. The null field generators powered down. Emergency lighting returned to full strength, revealing a team of exhausted recruits standing in defensive positions with empty rifles and spent magazines scattered around them that they'd held. The observation room felt too small for the number of people crammed inside. Council members occupied the front rows, their various forms making the seating arrangement look chaotic. Behind them, military observers and media representatives watched multiple screens showing replay footage from both teams' runs through the station. David sat with his team in a side section. They still wore their combat gear, still smelled like sweat and weapon discharge. Nira had her shoulder wrapped in a medical bandage where the simulation had registered a hit. Ferris sat with his leg elevated. They looked exhausted, but their eyes were alert as they watched the council deliberate on the main screen. Footage showed Grant's team deploying into the station. Their movements were textbook perfect, formations tight, communication constant. Then the null field activated. The change was immediate and devastating. Weapons went dark. Power armor locked up. One recruit fell when his armor's balance system failed. Within 90 seconds, the entire team was executing retreat protocols. A perfect demonstration of proper tactical response to an unwinnable scenario, one council member said. He was a tall being with crystalline skin similar to Commander Yali's, but with a purple hue. They recognized the situation was impossible and withdrew to minimize casualties. Another screen showed David's team. Their deployment was rougher, less coordinated. When a null field hit, there was a visible moment of adjustment as electronic systems failed. But then they kept moving forward, rifles firing, teams coordinating through hand signals, advancing when they should have been retreating. Reckless, a different council member declared. She had multiple tentacles and a voice that sounded like music. They proceeded into a known null field zone with primitive weapons. In real combat, such actions would be suicidal. Except they completed the objective, Commander Yali's said quietly. She stood near the screens, her crystalline form reflecting the footage. While the traditional approach resulted in withdrawal, the human approach resulted in success. At what cost? The purple-hued council member challenged. 2 casualties. In a real scenario, those would be deaths. Is that acceptable? David raised his hand. All eyes turned to him. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of species watching him. This wasn't just about weapons anymore. This was about philosophy, about how the galaxy approached conflict. Permission to speak, he said. Yali's nodded. Granted. 2 casualties is tragic, David began. But at Harvest Prime, 5,000 people died. Not 2. 5,000. And they died because the peacekeepers defending them had no ability to fight back when the null field activated. The room went very quiet. The traditional approach works in 99% of scenarios, David continued. Energy weapons are superior in almost every way. They're more powerful, more accurate, more efficient. But for that last 1%, when you face an enemy that can negate all your advantages, you need something that still works. He gestured to his team. These recruits aren't replacing their primary weapons. They're not abandoning galactic technology. They're learning backup skills for situations where their main equipment fails. That's not reckless. That's prepared. The purple-hued council member leaned forward. And what happens when every species in the galaxy arms themselves with these weapons? When diplomatic incidents escalate because everyone has the ability to fight. With respect, Pia said from her seat, they already have the ability to fight. Energy weapons are far more lethal than ballistic weapons. What we're offering is redundancy, not escalation. Threll stood up from his observer position. The avian instructor had been silent throughout the test, but now his 4 arms moved in agitated patterns. I've watched peacekeeper units fail against null field technology for 5 years. I've written reports to this council about the need for alternative weapons. Every report was dismissed as paranoid or warmongering. He pointed at the screens. That test showed 2 approaches to an impossible scenario. One approach followed doctrine and failed the objective. The other approach adapted and succeeded. If you cannot see the value in having options when your primary systems fail, then you've learned nothing from our losses. A long silence followed. The council members looked at each other, engaged in whatever communications their species used for private discussion. David could see the debate playing out in body language. Some were convinced. Others remained skeptical. A few looked outright hostile to the entire concept. Ambassador Walsh, Earth's representative to the Galactic Council, finally spoke. He was an older man with gray hair and the patient expression of someone who'd spent decades in diplomatic service. The council seems divided on this issue. Perhaps a compromise. What kind of compromise? The musical council member asked. Limited implementation, Walsh suggested. Allow human ballistic weapons as secondary armament for peacekeeping units operating in high-risk zones. Restrict their use to situations where null field technology is confirmed or suspected. Establish oversight protocols to prevent misuse. Run the program for 1 standard year, then review the results. The purple-hued council member shook his head. And if this escalates conflicts? If hostile species see this as provocation, then we'll be no worse off than we are now, Yali said. Currently, those hostile species operate with impunity in null field zones because they know we can't fight back. Perhaps having the ability to respond will encourage diplomatic solutions rather than military ones. The vote took 30 minutes. David watched as council members indicated their positions through various means. Some used electronic voting. Others used physical gestures. A few engaged in extended debate before deciding that, in the end, the compromise passed by a narrow margin. Human ballistic weapons would be authorized as secondary armament for peacekeeping forces. The program would be limited, monitored, and reviewed after 1 year. It wasn't everything David had hoped for, but it was something as the council chamber emptied. Nira approached David. Her silver fur was matted with sweat, and her shoulder bandage had a small amount of blue blood seeping through. But she was smiling. "My sister's name was Kessa," she said quietly. "She died at Harvest Prime with a useless weapon in her hands. Today, because of what you taught us, I completed a mission that should have been impossible. Thank you for giving me the tools to make sure other people don't go through what Kessa did." David didn't know what to say to that. He settled for a simple nod. Around them, the other recruits were celebrating quietly, the weight of what they'd accomplished settling in. Pia joined them, datapad in hand. "Commander Yales wants us to start designing training programs for other bases. We've got requests from 6 different military districts already. We just finished one program," David said. "And it worked," Pia replied. "Now everyone wants what we have. Redundancy, backup plans, the ability to fight when everything else fails. Turns out those are pretty popular concepts when you're the one getting shot at." Grant approached from across the room. The massive reptilian recruit looked uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology," he said to David. "I thought human weapons were a joke. I was wrong." David extended his hand. After a moment, Grant took it. The handshake was awkward between their different physiologies, but the gesture mattered more than the execution. "You followed doctrine perfectly," David said. "There's no shame in that. But doctrine needs to account for situations where standard procedures don't work." "Perhaps," Grant agreed. "Would you teach me about your weapons?" David glanced at Pia, who shrugged. "We're starting new training sessions in 3 weeks," she said. "You're welcome to join." The galaxy was beginning to learn what humans had known for centuries. The best plan was the one that worked when all your other plans failed. 8 months had passed since the field test. David stood in training complex theta, watching 200 recruits from 40 different species learn to field strip rifles in under 60 seconds. The facility was 3 times larger than Workshop Base 7 had been, with dedicated ranges, simulation chambers, and modification workshops. Pia moved between workstations, helping a mantis-like recruit adjust a custom grip she designed. The engineer had a team of 12 assistants now, all working on adapting human weapons to alien physiologies. Every week brought new challenges. Last month, they designed a rifle for a species with no hands at all, using trunk-like appendages instead. It had taken 4 prototypes, but the final version worked. "Instructors front," David called. Nira, Lynn, Bosk, and Qual approached, along with 6 other graduates from the original program. They wore instructor badges now, authorized to teach ballistic combat to new recruits. Grant was there too, having completed accelerated training and proven himself skilled enough to help others. "We have a problem," David said, pulling up a holographic display. "Command just sent this through." The Corvith Empire attempted another raid, this time on Helion Station in the Outer Territories. The display showed tactical data. Corvith ships had deployed null field generators as expected. Peacekeeper forces had responded with the new protocols, using ballistic weapons to maintain combat effectiveness. The raiders had retreated after encountering resistance they hadn't anticipated. "0 casualties on our side," David continued. "Minimal damage to the station. The Corvith lost 3 boarding parties." "That's good news, isn't it?" Qual asked, his voice bubbling slightly. "It's complicated news," Nira said. She'd been reading tactical reports for months now, learning to think beyond individual combat. "The Corvith won't give up just because one raid failed. They'll adapt." "They already are," David confirmed. He pulled up another report. "Intelligence indicates they're developing weapons specifically designed to counter ballistic firearms. Armor that can stop projectiles, shields that deflect physical objects. We forced them to innovate." Threll entered the training bay, his blue feathers ruffled. "The Council is debating whether this proves ballistic weapons were a mistake. Some members argue that we've escalated an arms race." "We didn't start the arms race," Pia said. "The Corvith did when they started using null field technology against civilian targets. We just refused to be helpless victims." "Try explaining that to politicians," Threll replied, but there was no heat in his words. The instructor had become one of the program's strongest supporters after seeing the results. Regardless of politics, Our job continues. We have 3 more classes scheduled and requests from civilian security forces wanting training for their personnel. David looked at his team of instructors. They'd come so far from those early days in Workshop Base 7. Nira had overcome her fear and become one of the best marksmen in the program. Lynn's analytical mind had revolutionized how they taught ballistic physics. Bosk's gentle nature made him excellent at working with nervous recruits. Qual had developed advanced scouting techniques that didn't rely on electronic systems. The Corvus will adapt, David said. So we'll adapt too. That's what this whole program has been about. Not just weapons, but mindset. The galaxy spent thousands of years developing incredible technology. But they forgot that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. He pulled up training schedules on the display. Next month, we're expanding the curriculum. In addition to ballistic weapons, we're teaching improvised explosives, mechanical traps, and non-electronic communication systems. Everything that works when the power goes out. Some species will hate that, Grant said. They'll say we're becoming primitives. Let them say it, David replied. We're not becoming primitives. We're becoming prepared. There's a difference. Pia brought up her own display, showing weapon modification schematics. I've been working with Earth's manufacturing divisions. We're developing a new line of weapons specifically for galactic use. Modular components that can be adjusted for different species, ammunition that works in various atmospheric conditions, materials that hold up in extreme environments. Human engineering at its finest, Lynn said. Practical, adaptable, reliable. The training session ended. Recruits filed out of the complex, carrying rifles that would serve as their backup when their primary weapons failed. Some were excited. Others were still skeptical. But all of them understood the lesson now. Having options was better than having none. Commander Yali's visited later that evening. Her crystalline form caught the setting sun through the complex's windows, scattering rainbow light across David's office. She moved slowly, as if carrying weight that wasn't physical. The council wants a full report on the Halion Station incident, she said. They're concerned about escalation. Are they concerned enough to give up the advantage we now have? David asked. No, Yali's admitted. 3 more districts have requested ballistic training programs. Civilian governments are asking for human weapons to protect colonies in contested zones. The demand has exceeded even my projections. She pulled up casualty statistics. Before the ballistic program, 47 deaths in null field engagements over 2 years. After the program, 3 deaths in 8 months, all from situations where ballistic weapons weren't available in time. David studied the numbers. 44 people who were alive because they'd had weapons that worked when everything else failed. 44 families that hadn't lost someone to an enemy that operated with technological impunity. It's not perfect, he said, but it's better. Better is all we can hope for in this work, Yali's replied. After she left, David walked through the training complex. Night shift instructors were working with recruits who had daytime jobs. The sound of rifle fire echoed from the ranges. In the modification workshops, engineers were testing new designs under simulated combat conditions that he found Pia in her workshop, working late as usual. She was designing a rifle for a species that lived in aquatic environments. The challenge was making something that could fire underwater without compromising performance in atmosphere. This is impossible, she said cheerfully, which means I'll probably figure it out by next week. David smiled. That was the human approach in a single sentence. Face an impossible problem, refuse to accept that it's impossible, then work until you solve it anyway. The council is worried, he told her. The council is always worried, Pia replied without looking up from her designs. That's their job. Our job is to make sure peacekeepers come home alive. Simple, direct, practical. The galaxy had spent millennia pursuing sophistication and advancement. Humans had spent that time learning to survive. Both approaches had value, but only one worked when all the sophisticated technology failed. David thought about his first day on Sentinel 7, standing in line with dozens of alien recruits. He'd been the odd one out, the human with the primitive weapon that everyone mocked. Now that weapon and the philosophy behind it were spreading across the galaxy. Not because humans were superior, not because ballistic weapons were better than energy weapons, but because the galaxy had learned what humans knew from living on a dangerous world. Always have a backup plan. Never rely completely on technology. And when someone says something is impossible, reload and try anyway to end training bays across a dozen worlds. Recruits were learning to chamber rounds by hand, to count their ammunition, to make every shot matter. They were learning that advanced and effective weren't always the same thing. That old solutions sometimes worked better than new ones. That preparation mattered more than sophistication. The Corvith would adapt. Other threats would emerge. The galaxy would face new challenges that required new solutions. But now, when those challenges came, peacekeepers would have options. They would have redundancy. They would have the knowledge that even if their main systems failed, they could still fight back. David picked up one of the rifles from Pia's workbench. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, modified for a species he'd never heard of, adapted to work in environments he couldn't imagine. But at its core, it was still a simple machine. A controlled explosion, a metal projectile, physics that had worked the same way for centuries. No weapon works, the trainer had said, but the human had reloaded anyway. And in that simple act of stubborn defiance, he'd changed how an entire galaxy thought about combat, preparation, and the value of keeping simple solutions ready when complex ones failed. The galaxy was learning. Slowly, reluctantly, but learning. And humans, the newest members of the galactic community, were teaching lessons they'd learned on a harsh world where adaptation wasn't just smart, it was survival.